Lucas, this star catches your nightmares, Zora Mitchell whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the dim penthouse glow. In Atlanta's glittering skyline, where wealth masked pain, no one could tame Lucas, the 4-year-old son of billionaire Jasper Caldwell. Abandoned by his mother for a younger lover, Lucas turned from gentle to volatile, his screams echoing through marble halls. 10 nannies fled his rage. Jasper, a titan crumbling under guilt, watched helplessly. But Zora, a maid unnoticed by all, saw the boy's broken heart, mirroring her own childhood loss. One night everything shifted. Jasper saw the impossible unfold. What secret did Zora carry? How could a maid succeed where experts failed? Stay to uncover a story of healing through unseen bonds, where a single star rewrote a family's fate. The penthouse perched atop Atlanta's skyline, a glass fortress where every surface gleamed with cold perfection. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft patterns on the marble floor, but the air inside carried a weight heavier than the city's humid haze. Zora Mitchell, a black maid in a blue uniform, pushed her cleaning cart through the quiet expanse, her movements precise, almost invisible. Her brown eyes, sharp yet tender, scanned the room, not for dust, but for the small figure huddled in the corner of the living area. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old, sat with his knees drawn tight, his small hands clutching a broken toy truck. His blue eyes, once bright with laughter, now burned with a fury that made the vast penthouse feel suffocatingly small. Lucas hadn't always been this way. Months ago, he'd been a whirlwind of giggles chasing his mother's laughter through these same halls. But she was gone now, vanished with a younger man who promised her a life unshackled by motherhood. Lucas had clung to her legs that final day, his tiny voice pleading, "Don't go, Mommy, please." She'd pried his hands free, her eyes averted, and walked out the door. The betrayal carved a wound in the boy that no one could reach. Not the nannies, not the therapists, and certainly not his father, Jasper Caldwell. To Lucas, Jasper was the villain, the reason his mother had fled. "You made her leave!" he'd screamed, his voice raw, the accusation a knife in Jasper's chest. Jasper stood in his office down the hall, the door ajar, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos in his heart. At 45, he was a titan of Caldwell Innovations, a tech empire that turned ideas into billions. But success meant nothing when his son's world had collapsed. Jasper's fingers hovered over his laptop, a financial report blurring before his eyes. He heard the crash of another toy against the wall, Lucas's silent rage erupting into sound. His shoulders sagged, the weight of failure pressing down. He'd tried everything. 10 nannies in 6 months, each one fleeing in tears or frustration. The latest, a soft-spoken woman with a resume full of credentials, had lasted 3 days before Lucas locked her out of his room, her patience shattered like the toys he broke. Zora paused her cart, her hand still on the handle, her breath catching as Lucas hurled a plastic car across the room. It skidded to a stop near her feet, its wheels spinning uselessly. She didn't flinch. She'd seen this before, not in Lucas, but in herself years ago. At 6, she'd watched her father walk out, his suitcase in hand, leaving her with a mother too broken to care. The memory stung, a quiet ache that never faded. Zora's eyes softened as she watched Lucas, his small frame trembling, his anger a mask for the grief he couldn't name. She wanted to kneel beside him, to say something, but she held back. She was just the maid, unseen, unheard, her role confined to cleaning the messes others left behind. Jasper emerged from his office, his footsteps heavy on the marble. "Lucas," he called, his voice strained, a plea wrapped in authority. The boy didn't look up, his fingers digging into the carpet, his silence louder than any scream. Jasper knelt, reaching out, but Lucas jerked away, his eyes flashing. "I hate you," he spat, the words sharp and deliberate. Jasper froze, his hands suspended in midair, the rejection cutting deeper than he'd admit. He stood, jaw tight, and turned away, his gaze catching Zora's for a fleeting moment. Her presence was a shadow, barely registered, yet her eyes held something he couldn't place, a quiet understanding that made him pause before retreating to his office. Lucas's anger simmered, his small chest heaving. He grabbed another toy, a wooden block, and threw it, the thud echoing in the sterile space. Zora's heart twisted. She knew that kind of pain, the kind that made you lash out because it was easier than crying. She'd spent years swallowing her own hurt, folding it into the corners of her life. But Lucas was too young to hide his. His mother's abandonment had rewritten him, turning a gentle boy into a storm of rage and silence. At school, he'd sit alone at pickup, watching other children run to their parents' arms, their laughter a reminder of what he'd lost. The driver who collected him was kind, but distant, a poor substitute for the warmth he craved. Jasper sank into his office chair, the door now closed, shutting out the sound of Lucas's tantrum. His fingers rubbed his temples, the weight of his empire a distant concern compared to the chaos in his home. He'd built Caldwell Innovations from nothing, a testament to his relentless drive, but he couldn't build a bridge to his son. Every attempt failed, hugs rebuffed, words ignored, love met with accusations. He'd hired the best. Psychologists from Ivy League schools, behavior coaches flown in from abroad, even a music therapist with a harp. None could break through Lucas's wall. The nannies paid generously came with glowing references, but Lucas's rage was a force they couldn't withstand. One had called him feral, her voice trembling as she quit, leaving Jasper to wonder if he was failing as a father or if his son was simply broken. Zora moved to the kitchen, her cart gliding silently. She wiped down the counter, her hands steady but her mind on Lucas. She saw the way he clutched his broken toys, as if they were the only things he could control. She remembered her own childhood, the nights she'd spent clutching a worn pillow, pretending it was her father's hand. Pain recognized pain, and Lucas's was a mirror to her own. She wanted to help, but boundaries held her back. She was the maid, not a nanny, her role defined by mops and rags, not comfort or care. Yet something in Lucas's eyes, a flicker of desperation beneath the anger, pulled at her. In the living area, Lucas's tantrum slowed, his energy spent. He slumped against the wall, his small body curled tight, his breath ragged. Zora paused, her cloth still in hand, and watched him from across the room. She thought of the straw stars she kept in her bag, small tokens she'd woven to soothe her own heart after her father left. They were nothing fancy, just bits of dried grass twisted into shape. But they'd been her anchor. She wondered if Lucas needed an anchor too, something to hold on to when the world felt like it was slipping away. But she didn't move closer. Not yet. She knew trust wasn't given. It was earned, and she wasn't sure she had the right to try. Jasper opened his office door. The sound of silence unnerved him more than the crashes. He stepped into the living area, his heart sinking at the sight of Lucas curled up, alone. He wanted to scoop his son into his arms, to promise he'd fix everything, but the memory of "I hate you" stopped him. He glanced at Zora, still cleaning, her presence a quiet constant in the chaos. He didn't know her story, didn't even know her last name, but for a moment he envied her calm. He turned back to Lucas, his voice softer now. "Buddy, let's get you some lunch." Lucas didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor, his small hand still gripping the broken truck. Zora's chest tightened as she watched the exchange. She saw the love in Jasper's eyes, the kind her own father had never shown. But she also saw Lucas's pain, raw and unyielding, a wound that mirrored her own. She pushed her cart toward the hallway, her steps deliberate, her mind racing. She wasn't supposed to get involved, but something about Lucas made it impossible to stay invisible. As she passed the living area, she glanced at the boy one last time, her heart whispering a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I see you, Lucas, and I won't look away." The penthouse fell quiet again, but it was a silence that screamed, of a boy lost in grief, a father drowning in guilt, and a maid who saw what no one else could. The pieces were there, scattered like Lucas's broken toys, waiting for someone to pick them up. The penthouse hummed with a quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace, its marble floors catching the soft glow of sunlight through towering windows. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and a storm in a small body, sat alone in the schoolyard, his sneakers scuffing the dirt as other children's laughter pierced the air. Their parents swept them into warm embraces, voices bright with love, while Lucas waited for the driver, a man whose polite nod offered no comfort. The absence of his mother, who'd walked away 6 months ago for a younger lover, was a wound that bled anew each day. Back home, Lucas's rage spilled over, a book torn page by page, its pieces fluttering like broken promises across the living room floor. His blue eyes, once soft, now glinted with defiance, a silent vow to keep the world at bay. Zora Mitchell moved through the penthouse, her cleaning cloth gliding over a glass table, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She heard the rip of paper, the thud of another toy hitting the wall, and her heart clenched. Lucas's pain was a mirror to her own, a reflection of the 6-year-old girl she'd been when her father left, without a backward glance. She'd stood in her mother's kitchen, clutching a worn pillow, willing it to hold her together. Now, watching Lucas shred a picture book, she saw that same desperate need to break something before it broke him. She wanted to reach out, to offer more than a clean surface, but the invisible line between maid and family held her back. Her role was to erase messes, not mend hearts. Jasper Caldwell emerged from his office, the weight of another failed investor call pressing on his shoulders. His empire at Caldwell Innovations demanded precision, but his home was a battlefield he couldn't navigate. "Lucas," he called, his voice a mix of exhaustion and hope, stepping into the living room where the wreckage of toys and torn pages lay scattered. Lucas didn't look up, his small hands ripping another page, the sound sharp in the stillness. Jasper knelt, his knees creaking, and reached for his son. "Buddy, let's talk." Lucas jerked away, his voice a hiss. "You made Mommy leave. I don't want you." The words landed like a blow, and Jasper's hand fell, his face a mask of pain he couldn't hide. He stood, retreating to the edge of the room, his eyes flickering to Zora, who stood frozen, her cloth still in hand. Zora's chest tightened as she watched Lucas's small frame tremble, his anger a shield against the grief he couldn't name. She remembered her own nights of silent fury, throwing toys at walls because it was easier than crying for a father who'd never return. Lucas's rejection of Jasper wasn't just anger. It was a plea for someone to see his hurt. She glanced at the boy, his fingers now still, clutching a torn page with a picture of a smiling family. Her own childhood flashed before her, the empty chair at dinner, her mother's hollow eyes. She wanted to cross the room, to tell Lucas he wasn't alone, but the rules of her job, stay quiet, stay unseen, kept her rooted. At the school earlier that day, Lucas had sat on a bench, his backpack untouched, watching a girl hug her mother. The sight had twisted something inside him, a knot of longing and betrayal. He'd kicked the dirt, his sneakers leaving jagged lines, and when the driver arrived, Lucas had climbed into the car without a word, his silence louder than any tantrum. Now, in the penthouse, that silence turned to destruction. He grabbed a stuffed dinosaur, yanking at its tail until stitches popped, his small face contorted with rage. Zora's hand paused on the table, her breath catching. She knew that kind of destruction, tearing apart what you loved because it couldn't love you back. Jasper watched from the doorway, his heart a lead weight. He'd faced boardrooms full of skeptics, turned failing startups into empires, but his son's pain was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He'd hired experts, psychologists with thick books, nannies with gentle voices, but Lucas's anger burned through them all. The last nanny, a woman with a PhD in child development, had called him unreachable before quitting, her eyes wide with defeat. Jasper had stood in this same spot then, watching Lucas destroy a puzzle, and felt the same helpless ache. Now, as Lucas tore the book, Jasper's voice broke. "I'm trying, Lucas. I'm trying so hard." The boy didn't respond, his silence a wall Jasper couldn't climb. Zora moved to the kitchen, her steps deliberate, her mind racing. She saw Lucas's pain in every torn page, every broken toy. She remembered her own coping, how she'd whispered to herself at night, promising she'd never let anyone hurt her again. Lucas didn't have that promise yet. He was too young, too raw. She thought of the straw stars in her bag, small things she'd woven to hold her own grief. They weren't much, just bits of grass twisted into shape. But they'd been her lifeline. She wondered if Lucas needed something to hold, something to anchor him when the world felt like it was slipping away. But she hesitated. Her role as made a boundary she wasn't sure she could cross. Jasper stepped closer, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Lucas, please, let me help you." The boy's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "You can't. You made her go." He threw the book, its pages fluttering to the floor, and curled into himself, his small body shaking. Jasper's face crumpled, the accusation cutting deeper than any boardroom failure. He turned away, his shoulders hunched, and caught Zora's gaze again. For a moment their eyes locked, and he saw something in her. A flicker of understanding, a quiet strength that made him pause. But he said nothing, retreating to his office, the door closing with a soft click. Zora's hands trembled as she wiped the counter, her mind on Lucas. She saw the boy's defiance, his refusal to let anyone in, and recognized it as her own. She'd built walls after her father left, shutting out anyone who tried to get close. But Lucas was different. He was still breaking, still reachable, if only someone could find the right way. She glanced at the living room, where Lucas sat, his small hands now still, his eyes fixed on the torn page. The image of the smiling family mocked him, a reminder of what he'd lost. Zora's heart ached. She wanted to kneel beside him, to offer more than a clean house, but the fear of overstepping held her back. The penthouse fell quiet again, but it was a silence that screamed, of a boy drowning in betrayal, a father suffocating under guilt, and a maid who saw what no one else could. Lucas's small fingers traced the edge of the torn page, his anger spent but his pain raw. Zora watched from the kitchen, her cloth still, her heart whispering a vow she wasn't sure she could keep. "I see you, Lucas. I'll find a way." The penthouse carried the hush of a held breath, its marble floors gleaming under the soft spill of sunlight through towering windows. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and a tempest in a small frame, sat in the playroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his latest tantrum. Broken crayons and scattered blocks lay like casualties of his silent war, his blue eyes blazing with a defiance that masked a deeper ache. Zora Mitchell moved through the hallway, her cleaning cart gliding silently, her hands steady but her heart unsteady. She'd seen Lucas's pain before, in the torn pages and hurled toys, but today it cut deeper, echoing her own childhood grief when her father walked away, leaving nothing but silence. Lucas gripped a plastic robot, its arm bent from a previous outburst, and flung it against the wall with a sharp crack. The sound jolted Zora, her cloth pausing mid-wipe on a glass door. She remembered her own 6-year-old self, smashing a toy teacup against her bedroom floor, hoping the noise would drown out the emptiness. Lucas's rage wasn't just anger. It was a cry for someone to see him, to hold the pieces of his broken world. Zora's chest tightened, her instinct to reach out warring with the rules that kept her invisible. She was the maid, meant to clean, not comfort, but Lucas's pain was a mirror she couldn't ignore. Jasper Caldwell sat in his office, the door ajar, his fingers frozen over a spreadsheet. The crash from the playroom pierced the quiet, pulling him from numbers to the reality of his son's unraveling. He rose, his steps heavy, and stood at the playroom threshold. "Lucas," he said, his voice a fragile thread of hope. "Can we try something fun?" Lucas's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Go away," he spat, his small hands clutching another block, ready to throw. Jasper's face tightened, the rejection of familiar sting. He wanted to kneel, to pull his son close, but the memory of "I hate you" held him back. He retreated, his gaze catching Zora's for a fleeting moment, her presence a quiet anchor he barely registered. Zora's heart thudded as she watched Lucas hurl the block, its thud against the wall a punctuation to his pain. She knew that kind of fury, the kind that burned because it had nowhere else to go. She thought of the straw stars in her bag, small tokens she'd woven to hold her own grief after her father left. They were nothing special, just dried grass twisted into shape. But they'd been her refuge, a way to trap the hurt before it consumed her. Lucas needed something like that, she thought, a tether to keep him from drowning. She hesitated, her hand hovering over her apron pocket, the rules of her job a silent barrier. But then Lucas's shoulders slumped, his small body curling into itself, and something in Zora broke. She stepped into the playroom, her movements slow, deliberate. Lucas didn't look up, his fingers digging into the carpet, his breath uneven. Zora knelt a few feet away, her knees pressing against the cold floor. From her pocket, she pulled a straw star, its edges rough but its shape steady, like a promise. She set it on the carpet between them, saying nothing. Lucas's eyes flicked to it, his brow furrowing. "What's that stupid thing?" he snapped, his voice sharp but trembling. He grabbed the star and threw it, the small shape skidding across the floor. Zora didn't flinch. She reached for it, her fingers gentle, and placed it back between them. "It catches nightmares," she said softly, her voice a calm harbor. "But only if you let it." Lucas stared at the star, his small hands clenching, his anger wrestling with curiosity. He didn't touch it again, but he didn't throw it either. His eyes met Zora's, a flicker of something softer passing through them. Doubt, maybe, or the tiniest crack in his armor. Zora held his gaze, her own eyes steady, carrying the weight of her own childhood loss. She remembered the nights she'd clutched her straw stars, whispering to herself that she was enough. Lucas needed that too, she knew, but trust was a fragile thing, and she wouldn't push. She rose, returning to her cart, her heart pounding with a quiet vow. She'd try again. Jasper watched from the hallway, unnoticed, his breath catching at the exchange. He'd seen nannies try to soothe Lucas with toys, songs, promises. None had gotten this far. Zora's quiet gesture, the straw star, stirred something in him, a mix of awe and envy. He wanted to be the one to reach his son, to mend the rift his wife's abandonment had carved. But he was failing, and this maid, this stranger, had done what he couldn't. He turned away, his throat tight, and retreated to his office, the door closing softly behind him. The numbers on his screen blurred, not from fatigue, but from the realization that his son was slipping further from him. Lucas sat alone again, his small fingers tracing the edge of a broken crayon. The straw star lay a few feet away, untouched but not forgotten. His anger still simmered, but Zora's words echoed in his mind. "It catches nightmares." He didn't believe in such things, not really, but the star's presence felt different, like a hand extended in the dark. He glanced at the doorway, half expecting Zora to return, but she was gone, her cart's wheels a faint hum in the distance. For the first time that day, he didn't throw anything, his small body still, his heart a tangle of rage and longing. Zora pushed her cart down the hallway, her hands steady but her mind racing. She'd crossed a line, however small, and it scared her. She wasn't supposed to get involved, wasn't supposed to care. But Lucas's pain was a weight she couldn't ignore, a reflection of the girl she'd been, alone and unseen. She thought of her father, his back turned as he left, and the years she'd spent building walls to keep the hurt out. Lucas's walls were higher, sharper, but they weren't unbreakable. She'd seen that flicker in his eyes, that moment of hesitation. It was enough to keep her trying, to keep her hoping. The penthouse settled into its uneasy quiet, the sunlight softening as it slanted through the windows. Lucas's small hand hovered over the straw star, not touching it but not pushing it away either. Zora's words lingered, a whisper of possibility in a world that felt too heavy. And Jasper, behind his closed door, felt the weight of his failure, unaware that a single star might change everything. The penthouse pulsed with a fragile quiet, its vast spaces softened by the gentle spill of sunlight through high windows. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and carrying a storm within, sat in the kitchen, his small fingers tracing the edge of a table, the straw star from Zora Mitchell resting untouched in his lap. The memory of his mother's departure, her cold detachment as she pried his hands away, still burned, fueling his silence and defiance. Zora, the maid who dared to see him, moved through the kitchen, her cloth gliding over counters, her presence a steady undercurrent in the chaos. Her heart ached with every glance at Lucas. his blue eyes flickering between anger and something softer, a crack in the wall he'd built since his mother chose another life over him. Zora's hands trembled slightly as she polished a glass, her mind on the star she'd given Lucas. She'd woven it from dried grass, a small act of defiance against her own childhood pain, when her father's absence left her grasping for something to hold. Lucas's rejection of the star, his sharp "I don't need it," had stung, but his hesitation afterward, the way he'd kept it, sparked a fragile hope. She wanted to reach him, to offer more than a clean surface, but the weight of her role held her back. She was no nanny, no therapist, just a woman who knew what it felt like to be left behind. Yet Lucas's quiet presence in the kitchen, the star in his lap, felt like an invitation, a door slightly ajar. Lucas's gaze drifted to the star, its rough edges a contrast to the sterile perfection around him. He didn't understand why he'd kept it, why he hadn't thrown it again. His mother's face flashed in his mind, her smile fading as she walked away, leaving him with a father he blamed. He pushed the star across the table, his small hands shaking, not with anger, but with a longing he couldn't name. Zora paused, her cloth still, watching him. She saw the boy she'd been, alone in a world that didn't notice her pain. "Want to hear a story?" she asked, her voice soft, like a breeze through an open window. Lucas's eyes flicked up, wary but curious. He didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. Zora sat across from him, keeping her distance, her hands folding a new straw star as she spoke. "There was a bird," she began, her voice steady, small with wings too heavy to fly. "It got lost in a forest, scared, alone. But a star fell from the sky. Not big, not shiny, just enough to light its way." Lucas's fingers tightened on the star in his lap, his breath hitching. "Did it get home?" he whispered, his voice so small it nearly drowned in the quiet. Zora's heart leapt, but she kept her tone even. "It did, because it followed the star, and it wasn't alone anymore." Lucas looked down, his fingers tracing the star's edges, his silence softer now, less jagged. Jasper Caldwell stood in his office, the door half open, his fingers hovering over a contract he couldn't focus on. The sound of Zora's voice drifted through the penthouse, low and rhythmic, pulling him from his work. He stepped into the hallway, drawn by the unfamiliar calm. Peering into the kitchen, he saw Lucas sitting still, listening, the star in his hands. Jasper's chest tightened. He tried to reach his son, tried stories, games, even a clumsy puppet show the night before. "Want to hear about a pirate ship?" he'd asked, his voice hopeful, holding a book. Lucas had turned away, his voice sharp. "You tell stories wrong." The rejection had cut deep, leaving Jasper to retreat, his failure a heavy weight. Now watching Zora, Jasper felt a pang of envy. She'd done what he couldn't, what 10 nannies with credentials couldn't. Her story, simple and unpolished, held Lucas in a way Jasper's wealth and effort never had. He leaned against the wall, his breath shallow, torn between gratitude and inadequacy. He'd built an empire, turned dreams into billions, but his son's heart was a territory he couldn't conquer. Zora's presence, her quiet strength, stirred something in him, a longing to be the one Lucas turned to, mixed with awe at her ability to reach him. He stayed silent, not wanting to break the moment, his eyes lingering on the star in Lucas's hands. Lucas's small fingers moved over the star, his anger ebbing like a tide pulling back. Zora's story echoed in his mind. The bird, the star, the promise of not being alone. He didn't know why it mattered, why her voice felt like a hand reaching out. He thought of his mother, her last words a cold "I have to go," and the way his father's hugs felt empty, tainted by blame. But Zora was different. She didn't push, didn't demand he be okay. He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you tell another?" Zora's eyes softened, a warmth spreading through her. "Sure," she said, starting a new star. There was a shell, lost on a beach, that learned to sing. The penthouse kitchen, once a place of sterile efficiency, felt alive with the cadence of Zora's words. The staff noticed the shift. The cook, usually gruff, slid a plate of apple slices toward Lucas, his eyes flicking to Zora with a nod. The doorman passing through paused to listen, his usual scowl softening. Lucas didn't touch the apples, but he didn't push them away either, his attention fixed on Zora's story. The shell, she said, sang because it found a friend in the waves, someone who listened. Lucas's shoulders relaxed, his small body leaning slightly forward, the star now cradled in his hands. Jasper watched from the hallway, his heart a tangle of hope and pain. He wanted to join them, to be part of this fragile moment, but fear held him back. What if Lucas pushed him away again? What if his presence shattered the calm Zora had built? He thought of his own attempts, the story that fell flat, the hugs Lucas rejected. He'd poured his wealth into fixing his son, hiring experts who promised miracles, but they'd all failed. Zora, with nothing but a straw star and a story, had done what they couldn't. He felt a surge of gratitude, tinged with shame. Why her? Why not him? Zora kept her voice steady, her hands weaving the new star. But inside she was trembling. She'd crossed a line, speaking to Lucas, telling him stories. She wasn't supposed to be here, not like this. Her job was to clean, to fade into the background. But Lucas's small voice, "Can you tell another?" was a lifeline she couldn't ignore. She thought of her own childhood, the nights she told herself stories to keep the loneliness at bay. Lucas needed that too, she knew, and she couldn't turn away, not when his eyes held that flicker of trust. The sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the kitchen. Lucas held the star tighter, his small fingers tracing its edges, as Zora's story filled the space between them. The penthouse for a moment felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Jasper lingered in the hallway, unseen, his heart heavy with the weight of his son's pain and the hope that someone else might help him carry it. The penthouse held its breath, the soft glow of a nightlight casting shadows across the polished floors. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and a storm trapped in a small body, sat in his bedroom, the wreckage of his rage strewn around him, pillows torn, a toy car cracked against the wall. His mother's abandonment, a wound 6 months fresh, fueled his fury, her cold departure for a younger lover still echoing in his cries. Zora Mitchell, the maid who dared to see his pain, stood at the threshold, her heart pounding with a memory of her own childhood loss. She crossed a line with her stories and straw stars, but Lucas's screams tonight were a call she couldn't ignore, pulling her into the heart of his darkness. Lucas clutched a shredded blanket, his small frame trembling as he shouted into the quiet, "I hate you, Dad! You made her go!" His voice cracked, raw with grief, the accusation a dagger aimed at Jasper Caldwell, who wasn't there. Zora's breath caught, her own past rushing back, 6 years old, screaming at an empty doorway where her father had stood, his suitcase a final betrayal. She saw herself in Lucas, his anger a mask for a heart that longed to be held. She stepped into the room, her movements slow, her presence a quiet offering. Lucas's eyes flicked to her, wild and wet, but he didn't push her away. Zora knelt on the carpet, her knees sinking into its softness, her hands empty but open. "Lucas," she said, her voice a gentle tide, "I know what it's like to lose someone." He froze, his small hands tightening on the blanket, his breath hitching. "My dad left me too," she continued, her words steady but heavy with memory. "I thought it was my fault, that I wasn't enough. I was angry, like you." Lucas's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition cutting through his rage. "Did you cry?" he whispered, his voice so small it barely reached her. Zora nodded, her throat tight. "I did, and I kept my sadness in straw stars, so it wouldn't swallow me." She reached into her pocket, pulling out another straw star, its rough edges a testament to her own survival. She set it on the carpet between them, not pushing, just offering. Lucas stared at it, his fingers loosening on the blanket, his anger wavering like a flame in the wind. "Does it hurt forever?" he asked, his voice breaking, tears spilling down his cheeks. Zora's heart shattered, but she kept her gaze steady. "Not forever," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry it alone." She opened her arms, a quiet invitation, her eyes holding his with a promise she'd never break. Lucas hesitated, his small body trembling, torn between the walls he'd built and the need to be seen. Then, like a dam breaking, he lunged forward, collapsing into Zora's embrace, his sobs shaking them both. She held him, her arms a steady anchor, her warmth a shield against his storm. His tears soaked her shoulder, his small hands clutching her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Zora's eyes stung, memories of her own lonely nights flooding back. But she held him tighter, whispering, "You're not alone, Lucas. I'm here." The straw star lay beside them, a silent witness to a moment that changed everything. Jasper Caldwell stepped into the penthouse, and the quiet was unnerving after a late investor dinner. His heart, heavy with the weight of Lucas's rejection, urged him to check on his son. He moved through the hallway, the nightlight's glow casting a soft path. Stopping at Lucas's door, his chest tightened, bracing for another silent rebuff. Through the cracked door he froze, his breath catching. Zora sat on the floor, holding Lucas in her arms. The boy, usually a whirlwind of rage, was curled against her, sobbing, his small body nestled like it had found a home. The straw star lay nearby, its simplicity a stark contrast to the chaos Jasper knew too well. Zora's voice, a gentle murmur, carried words he couldn't hear but felt. "I've lost someone too, but you're not alone." Jasper stepped back, his eyes burning, a mix of awe and ache flooding him. She'd reached his son in a way he never could. Jasper's mind reeled, replaying his own failures. The story Lucas rejected, the hugs pushed away. He'd poured his wealth into experts, therapists with degrees, nannies with promises, but none had broken through. Zora, with nothing but a straw star and her quiet presence, had done the impossible. He felt gratitude, sharp and overwhelming, but also a piercing shame. Why her? Why not him? He wanted to be the one holding Lucas, mending his broken heart, but he stood frozen, a spectator to a miracle he hadn't earned. He retreated silently, his throat tight, the image of Zora and Lucas etched into his soul. Lucas's sobs softened, his small body growing heavy in Zora's arms. He clung to her, his tears slowing, the storm within him quieting for the first time in months. Zora held him, her own heart aching with the weight of her past. She remembered the nights she'd cried alone, wishing for someone to see her pain. Now holding Lucas, she felt a purpose she hadn't known since her father left, a chance to be the anchor she'd never had. She didn't speak, just rocked him gently, letting his tears say what words couldn't. The straw star gleamed faintly in the nightlight, a small beacon in the darkness. The penthouse, for that moment, felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. Lucas's breathing steadied, his small hand still clutching Zora, his trust fragile but real. Zora's heart swelled, a mix of fear and resolve. She'd crossed a line, stepping beyond her role. But Lucas's need was greater than any rule. She thought of her own straw stars, woven to hold her grief, and knew she'd give Lucas as many as he needed. Jasper, hidden in the shadows, carried the weight of his son's healing, a father humbled by a maid's quiet power. The penthouse lay steeped in a fragile stillness, its vast rooms softened by the gentle spill of sunlight through towering windows. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and carrying a wound too heavy for his small frame, sat in the playroom, his fingers tracing the straw star Zora had given him. The memory of her embrace, her whispered promise that he wasn't alone, lingered like a faint warmth in his chest, but his mother's abandonment still gnawed, a betrayal that fueled his quiet defiance. Zora Mitchell, the maid who dared to cross an invisible line, moved through the splayed hallway, her cleaning cart a silent companion, her heart heavy with the weight of what she'd started. She'd held Lucas, seen his pain, but now she faced the consequences of stepping beyond her role. Zora's hands trembled as she wiped a glass door, her mind replaying the moment in Lucas's bedroom. His tears, his small body clinging to her, had awakened something deep within, her own childhood grief, buried but never gone. She'd been 6 when her father left, his suitcase a final note in a song of abandonment. Holding Lucas, she'd felt the girl she'd been, desperate for someone to see her. But now doubt crept in. She was a maid, not a savior, her job bound by rules she'd broken. Lucas's trust, fragile as the straw star, was a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. She glanced toward the playroom, where Lucas sat, his blue eyes softer but still guarded, and her resolve hardened. She couldn't turn back now. Lucas clutched the straw star, its rough edges a strange comfort. He didn't understand why Zora's words, "You're not alone," stuck with him, why her arms felt safer than his father's. Jasper Caldwell, the man he blamed for his mother's departure, was a shadow he couldn't forgive. Lucas's small hands tightened, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to believe Zora, to trust her stories, but the pain of his mother's cold, "I have to go," was a wall he couldn't climb. He set the star down, his fingers lingering, a flicker of hope battling the darkness within. Jasper paced his office, the door ajar, his mind a storm of gratitude and guilt. The image of Zora holding Lucas, her voice a gentle anchor, haunted him. He'd built Caldwell Innovations into a titan, but his son's heart was a fortress he couldn't breach. He'd seen Zora's straw star, heard her stories, and felt a pang of inadequacy. Why could she reach Lucas when he couldn't? He stopped pacing, his fingers gripping the desk, his chest tight with a truth he didn't want to face. He was failing as a father. He needed to know more about Zora, this maid who'd done what experts couldn't. He picked up the phone, calling his assistant. "Get me her file," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Everything you can find." Zora moved to the kitchen, her cloth gliding over the counter, her thoughts on Lucas. She'd crossed a line, and the weight of it pressed on her. She wasn't supposed to care this much, wasn't supposed to feel her own wounds reopen with every tear Lucas shed. But his pain was hers, a shared language of loss. She thought of the straw stars she'd woven as a child, each one a small act of defiance against her father's absence. Lucas needed that defiance, that hope, but she wasn't sure how to give it without breaking more rules. Her hands paused, her eyes drifting to the playroom, where Lucas now drew with a crayon, the straw star beside him. The quiet was shattered by a sharp knock at the penthouse door. Zora froze, her cloth still, as Jasper emerged from his office. A man in a gray suit stood in the splayed hallway, his badge marking him as a representative from the cleaning agency. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone clipped, "we need to discuss Zora Mitchell. She's violated protocol by engaging with your son." Jasper's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "She's done what no one else could," he snapped, his voice low but fierce. "She's reached him." The man's expression didn't soften. "She's a maid, not a nanny. This is a liability. We recommend her termination." Jasper's hands clenched, his heart racing with a mix of anger and protectiveness. Zora stood in the kitchen, her ears catching the heated exchange. Her stomach twisted, fear mingling with defiance. She'd known this might happen, had felt the risk when she knelt beside Lucas. But his small voice, his tears, had made the rules feel meaningless. She thought of her own childhood, the nights she'd wished for someone to fight for her. Now she wanted to be that person for Lucas, but the agency's threat was a cold reminder of her place. She gripped her cloth, her resolve wavering, then glanced at Lucas, who looked up from his drawing, his eyes meeting hers. "Zora," he said softly, his voice a plea, "don't go." Her heart broke, but she forced a smile, nodding silently. Jasper's voice rose, sharp and unyielding. "She's not going anywhere," he said, stepping closer to the representative. "You don't get it. She's helping my son when no one else could." The man shook his head, his tone cold. "Rules are rules, Mr. Caldwell. You're putting us at risk." Jasper's eyes blazed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Then find another client." He turned away, dismissing the man, his heart pounding with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. Zora wasn't just a maid, she was Lucas's lifeline, and he wouldn't let her go. Lucas watched from the playroom, his small hands clutching the straw star, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't understand the words in the hallway, but he felt the tension, the threat of losing Zora. Her stories, her quiet presence, were the only things that made the pain bearable. He thought of his mother, her cold departure, and the way Jasper's hugs felt hollow. Zora was different. She saw him, not the broken boy everyone else saw. He drew a shaky star on his paper, his small voice whispering, Stay, Zora. The words were a prayer, a hope he barely dared to hold. Zora's hands trembled as she returned to cleaning, her mind a whirl of fear and determination. The agency's threat was real, but Lucas's plea was louder. She thought of her father, how his absence had shaped her, and vowed she wouldn't let Lucas feel that same void. She glanced at the playroom, seeing Lucas's drawing, the star a mirror of her own. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when Lucas needed her. Jasper stood in the hallway, the representative gone, his chest heaving. He'd faced down boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, but this fight felt personal. He thought of Lucas, curled in Zora's arms, and the straw star that had somehow reached him. He didn't know Zora's story, didn't know why she cared, but he felt a debt he couldn't repay. He glanced toward the playroom, his heart heavy with gratitude and guilt. He'd failed his son, but Zora hadn't. The penthouse settled into its quiet, but it was a quiet charged with defiance. A father ready to fight, a boy clinging to hope, and a maid who'd become more than she was meant to be. The penthouse thrummed with a quiet defiance, its polished surfaces catching the soft glow of sunlight through towering windows. Lucas Caldwell, 4 years old and a boy tethered to a fragile hope, sat in the playroom, his small hands clutching the straw star that had become his anchor. The memory of Zora Mitchell's embrace, her whispered promise that he wasn't alone, lingered like a shield against the pain of his mother's abandonment. But the threat of losing Zora, sparked by the agency's cold ultimatum, hung heavy, a shadow over his newfound calm. Zora, the maid who dared to cross an invisible line, moved through the hallway, her cleaning cart a silent witness to her turmoil. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and resolve, knowing she'd risked everything for a boy whose pain mirrored her own. Zora's hands shook as she polished a glass table, her mind replaying the agency representative's words. Liability, he'd called her, as if her care for Lucas was a mistake to be erased. She'd been 6 when her father walked away, leaving her to navigate a world that didn't see her. Holding Lucas, feeling his tears soak her shoulder, had awakened that old wound, but also a fierce determination. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was someone Lucas needed, and that truth was worth any consequence. But doubt gnawed at her. What if she'd gone too far? What if her actions cost her everything? She glanced toward the playroom where Lucas sat, his small fingers tracing the star, and her heart steadied. She'd fight for him, rules be damned. Lucas held the straw star, its rough edges a quiet comfort against the storm within. Zora's words, "You're not alone," echoed in his mind, a lifeline he clung to. His mother's departure, her cold, "I have to go," as she chose another life, still cut deep, but Zora's presence dulled the edges. He didn't understand why she cared, why her stories felt like truth when his father's hugs felt like lies. He blamed Jasper Caldwell for his mother's absence, his small heart heavy with resentment. But now the thought of Zora leaving, her voice, her stars, twisted his stomach. He drew a shaky star on a piece of paper, his small voice whispering, "Don't go, Zora." A plea he didn't know she'd heard. Jasper stood in his office, the door ajar, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The agency's threat to fire Zora burned in his chest, a challenge to everything he'd seen her do for Lucas. He'd built Caldwell Innovations into a titan, faced down skeptics and rivals. But this fight was personal. Zora had reached his son when he couldn't, when 10 nannies and countless experts had failed. He thought of the moment he'd seen her holding Lucas, the straw star a small miracle in a world of broken toys. His failure as a father, his son's "I hate you" and rejection of his stories stung, but Zora's success was a light he couldn't let go out. He needed her, for Lucas, for the family he was desperate to rebuild. Zora pushed her cart into the splayed hallway, her steps deliberate, her mind racing. She'd heard Jasper's defiance, his sharp, "She's not going anywhere" to the agency man, but the weight of her actions pressed harder. She wasn't supposed to be this person, someone who mattered, someone who stayed. Her childhood had taught her to stay invisible, to avoid the pain of being seen and then discarded. But Lucas's plea, "Don't go, Zora," had cracked that armor. She thought of her own nights, clutching straw stars to keep her father's absence at bay, and knew she couldn't let Lucas face that void. She stopped, her hands still, and made a silent vow. She'd stay, no matter the cost. Jasper stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding as he approached Zora. The sunlight caught the edge of his desk, but his focus was on her, the woman who changed everything. "Zora," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We need to talk." She turned, her brown eyes steady but guarded, bracing for judgment. "The agency wants you gone," he said, his words clipped, anger simmering beneath them. "They say you broke rules, that you're a risk." Zora's chest tightened, her fear rising, but she held his gaze. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I just saw him hurting." Jasper's throat tightened, her words cutting through his defenses. "You did what I couldn't," he said, his voice breaking. "You reached him. I've tried. God, I've tried, but he pushes me away. You're the only one he trusts." Zora's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "I'm not a nanny, Mr. Caldwell. I'm just me. And I don't want pity." Jasper stepped closer, his voice fierce. "This isn't pity. It's gratitude. Lucas needs you, and I'm not letting them take you away." Lucas slipped into the hallway, unnoticed, his small hands clutching the straw star. He'd heard the raised voices, felt the tension like a storm brewing. His heart raced, fear gripping him at the thought of losing Zora. She was the only one who saw him, who made the pain feel smaller. He thought of his mother, her cold departure, and the way Jasper's promises felt empty. Zora was different. Her stories, her stars, were real. He stepped forward, his voice small but clear. "Don't go, Zora," he said, his eyes wide, tears brimming. "You make it hurt less." Zora's breath caught, her heart breaking at his plea. She knelt, her hand hovering near his, not touching but close. "I'm trying to stay, Lucas," she said, her voice a promise. Jasper's chest ached as he watched his son, the boy who'd rejected him, reach for Zora. He felt a surge of gratitude, but also a sharp pang of failure. He'd built an empire, but he couldn't build a bridge to Lucas. Zora had, with nothing but a straw star and a heart that understood loss. He turned to her, his voice resolute. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his eyes burning with determination. "I'm ending the agency's contract. I want you here, not as a maid, but as someone who matters to Lucas, to us." Zora's eyes widened, doubt and hope warring within her. "I don't want favors," she said, her voice firm. "I'll stay, but only as me." Jasper nodded, a rare vulnerability in his gaze. "That's all I'm asking." The penthouse felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. Lucas stood closer to Zora, his small hand brushing hers, the straw star a quiet bond between them. Jasper watched, his heart heavy with the weight of his son's trust in someone else, but also lifted by the hope that Lucas might heal. Zora rose, her resolve stronger, her fear tempered by Lucas's need. She crossed a line, but it was a line worth crossing. The sunlight slanted through the windows, casting a warm glow on the three of them, a fragile trio bound by pain and possibility. The penthouse shimmered with a newfound warmth, its vast spaces softened by sunlight filtering through high windows. Lucas Caldwell, now 5, moved through the playroom, his small hands clutching a straw star, its rough edges a quiet testament to the hope Zora Mitchell had kindled. The pain of his mother's abandonment, a wound that once fueled his rage, had softened. Her absence was no longer a blade, but a dull ache. Zora, the maid who'd become his anchor, stood in a newly crafted room within the penthouse, its walls lined with books and stars hanging from the ceiling. Her heart carried the weight of her own past, but also a fierce pride in the boy who'd begun to heal. Jasper Caldwell, the billionaire who'd once stood on the sidelines, watched from the doorway, his chest tight with gratitude and a lingering ache for the years he'd lost with his son. Lucas's blue eyes, once clouded with anger, now sparkled with a cautious joy. He sat cross-legged on the floor, helping Zora arrange a circle of straw stars for a group of children, sons and daughters of Caldwell Innovations employees. The room, dubbed the Sparrow Program, was Zora's creation, a sanctuary born from Jasper's decision to keep her close. Lucas's small fingers fumbled as he handed a star to a shy girl, his voice soft but clear. "This one keeps bad dreams away." The words echoed Zora's, a lesson he'd taken to heart. His mother's betrayal still lingered, but Zora's presence, her stories, her quiet strength, had shown him he wasn't alone. He glanced at her, a smile flickering, and her heart swelled with a love she hadn't expected to feel. Zora moved among the children, her hands guiding theirs as they wove straw stars, her voice weaving stories of sparrows that found their way home. She remembered her own childhood, the nights she'd sat alone, twisting grass to hold her father's absence at bay. Lucas had changed that, his trust pulling her from the shadows. But the weight of her new role pressed on her. She wasn't a maid anymore, but a guide, a beacon for children like Lucas. The responsibility scared her, stirring memories of her own unseen pain. Yet every time Lucas looked at her, his eyes bright with something new, she felt a resolve stronger than her fear. She'd been invisible once, but now she was seen, and she wouldn't let that light fade. Jasper leaned against the doorway, his usual polish replaced by a softer presence, his eyes fixed on Lucas. The boy who'd once pushed him away now laughed, a sound that pierced Jasper's heart with both joy and regret. He'd failed Lucas for so long, his connection attempts, stories, hugs, promises, met with rejection. Zora had succeeded where he couldn't, her straw stars and simple tales breaking through where his wealth had faltered. He thought of the night he'd seen her hold Lucas, the moment that changed everything. His gratitude for her was a living thing, but so was his guilt. He'd built an empire, but his son had needed a heart, not a fortune. Watching Lucas now, helping another child, Jasper felt a flicker of hope. He might still find a way to be the father his son deserved. The Sparrow program room buzzed with quiet energy, children's voices mingling as they listened to Zora's latest story. A sparrow that learned to sing after losing its flock. Lucas leaned forward, his small hands still, his eyes wide. "Did it find a new family?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Zora pause. She met his gaze, her throat tight. "It did," she said softly, "because it kept singing, and someone heard." Lucas nodded, his fingers brushing the star, a small smile breaking through. Zora's heart ached, not with pain but with pride. She saw the boy she'd first met, caged in rage, and the boy he was becoming, open, hopeful, hers in a way she hadn't expected. Jasper stepped into the room, his presence tentative, as if he feared breaking the spell. He'd watched Lucas change, eating without tantrums, drawing stars instead of tearing pages, even letting Jasper ruffle his hair. Last night, Lucas had laughed at a silly joke Jasper told, a moment so small yet monumental it nearly brought him to his knees. He looked at Zora now, her voice a steady rhythm, and felt a debt he could never repay. She'd given him back his son, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, stubborn care. He wanted to thank her, to tell her what it meant, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he stood silently, his eyes tracing the stars hanging above, each one a reminder of her impact. At the program's opening, Zora stood before a small crowd, employees, their children, a few curious executives. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I was invisible once," she said, her eyes finding Lucas in the front row. "So was my pain, but Lucas saw me and I saw him. Healing starts when someone notices." Lucas ran to her, wrapping his arms around her legs, his small voice clear. "You're my star, Zora." The room stilled, a collective breath held, as tears pricked Zora's eyes. She knelt, hugging him, her heart full. Jasper at the back whispered, "Thank you, Zora," his voice thick with emotion. The crowd stood frozen, not in shock but in awe, moved by a woman who'd turned pain into light. Lucas clung to Zora, his small body warm against hers, the straw star pressed between them. He thought of his mother, her cold departure, but the pain felt smaller now, softened by Zora's stories and the stars that held his nightmares. He looked at Jasper standing at the back and felt a flicker of something new. Not anger, but a question. Could his father be part of this new light? Zora's hand rested on his shoulder, her touch a promise, and Lucas felt safe, seen, no longer alone. Jasper watched, his heart a tangle of gratitude and longing. He'd once thought wealth could fix anything, but Zora had shown him otherwise. Her stories, her stars had rebuilt what his money couldn't. He stepped closer, his eyes on Lucas, and for the first time, he believed he might earn his son's trust. The penthouse, once a fortress of pain, now felt like a home, its walls echoing with the quiet strength of a woman who changed everything. The penthouse falls silent, but its story echoes, of a boy who found light in his darkness, a maid who became a beacon, and a father who learned to see. Lucas, Zora, and Jasper remind us that healing begins when someone notices, when pain is met with presence. Their journey, woven with straw stars, speaks to the power of connection in a world quick to overlook the unseen. What did their story stir in you? Did Lucas's courage, Zora's empathy, or Jasper's redemption touch your heart? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Thank you for joining us in this tale of hope and heart. Stay with us for more stories that uncover the quiet strength within us all. Until next time, keep seeing those who need it most.